That's one of the oldest stories that people have been telling each other forever, is that ignored things grow in the darkness outside the city until they become monstrous and break down the walls. And so you think, I'm afraid of listening, I'm afraid of hearing the problems. And that's fair enough. It's no wonder you're afraid. But you're nowhere near afraid enough of not doing that, because that's a bloody catastrophe. That'll be a bomb that'll go off in 10 years and blow up your marriage. You'll find out that your wife had an affair because, well, for her own reasons and because you didn't pay any attention to her for like 15 years. And then you think, well, I was afraid to pay attention. And yeah, fair enough. But now look where you are. You're in hell. And that's just not an improvement. Change the things you do every day. The things that repeat. Those are your life. That's the routine around which your life is built. People very much overvalue special occasions and vacations and that sort of thing, and they don't pay nearly enough attention to the kind of thing you're doing with your son. It's like that's once a week. You might be able to do that for years. It's 3% of your life. If you get that perfect, you've got 3% taken care of, and you can move to the next small piece and do the same thing. You do that with some friends, and you do that with your wife, for example, a couple of times a week, a couple of hour sessions. You know, one of the things I found in my practice was that this is useful for people who are trying to embark on an intimate relationship, is you need to talk to your wife about the domestic economy and the practicalities of your life together for about 90 minutes a week. And you need to date at least once a week for that length of time, or maybe twice if you can manage that. And if you don't do that, you will become isolated and lonely, and you'll develop a backlog of communication. And if you don't fix that, you'll end up divorced, and then you'll be fixing it for the rest of your life. You might be able to sit down with your wife and say, well, look, if we could have the dinner times that we really wanted, if they were optimal, what would that look like? Well, let's say you have a couple of kids. You think, well, do we all want to sit down together as a family? This has to be a question, right? Do we all want to sit down? Okay, yes. Well, how often? Do we want to do that like 7 nights a week? Is this something that's actually a crucial foundation for our family? Or can we do it 5 nights a week and maybe do something different on Friday? And you think, well, do all those micro things have to be negotiated? And the answer is, those aren't micro things. You do that every day. They're absolutely foundational. And then you want to hear what the other person has to say, because if you don't, they're not going to be fully on board. Plus, they might have a better idea than you. You never know. So let's say we decide, well, we're going to have dinner together at 6 o'clock, 5 nights a week. And we're going to let people forage 1 night a week and maybe sit in front of the TV. And we're going to go out 1 night a week, something like that. And we'll try that for a while. And then the next question is, well, what would we like to serve? And who's going to cook and who's going to clean up? And if we wanted it to go as well as it possibly could, how are we going to get the kids involved? And do we want to experiment with some new foods? And you know, that meal time, if that's the evening meal, let's say that's 90 minutes, that's more than 1/10 of your day. And so that's 10% of your life. That's literally 10% of your life.
It's compound interest. That grows over time. It's like putting 15% of your income in retirement. It grows to infinitely more than 15% of your income over time. So if you take care of that 10%, it's not just taking care of that 10%. Suddenly, if your marriage is in sync, you're an infinitely better parent,
right?
Infinitely better citizen,
right.
Infinitely better worker. We think in pictures, but we speak in words. And if couples can simply align their pictures, then you get a very clear path. So when my wife comes to me on a Monday and says, hey, this weekend, you and me, we're gonna go on the hottest date. And then she just walks away. Monday night, I'm wondering where we're going. Tuesday night, I'm wondering what I'm wearing and for how long, right? By Wednesday and Thursday, I'm wondering who's gonna keep the kids, and I don't care because they're gonna be fine, and what hotel we're gonna end up at. And then Saturday comes along, I show up in a suit, and she shows up in her running shorts and a t-shirt. And I say, what are you doing? And she says, what are you doing? And I say, I thought we were going on a hot date. And she says, it's 7 tacos for $10 down at Taco Hut. We're going on a hot date. Hey, I love tacos, and I hope she loves the occasional rendezvous. But we both used the word date, and we had very different pictures. Now I'm upset, she's upset. So in my house, every single day of the week, every day I'm not on the road, we ask ourselves this question: hey, what's the picture of today look like? It's just become a vernacular in our home. And so when she says, I need some space this evening, I need some time by myself, I tend to go, okay, cool. After dinner and after the kids and after you're done writing, I won't hassle you for the last 8 minutes of the day. For her, she's thinking, the moment you walk in this house, I'm out and I might come back in a week, right? We just have to align our pictures, and I'm cool either way and she's cool either way. It's just managing those expectations and being so clear with one another. What would you tell clients back in the day when they would come to you and they'd have a 3-year-old and they have an infant, they have child number 2, and they would say, we're not having sex anymore?
My first response is, how often do you want to have sex? People hate that question, and so they avoid it. They say, well, you know, we don't really want to be that calculating about it. It's like, okay, right, whatever. We're going to parameterize this. Once a year. It's like, no, that's probably too little. Okay, 15 times a day. It's like, no, that's probably too much. Okay, so now we got some parameters here. It's somewhere between once a year and 15 times a day. Let's see if we can narrow that in. And this does make people uncomfortable, right? They don't want to specify their needs and wants. They're unwilling to share the information with their partner because it's revealing. And then they're afraid they're going to be rebuffed, and they're afraid they're going to get into a fight. They've got lots of reasons not to want to do it. And they don't want to have the difficult conversation up front. And so we might say, well, let's be reasonable about this. It's going to be some number of times a week. You guys have jobs, you have kids, you're busy. You're not going to have a hot date every night. You just don't have time for it. And so why don't we be reasonable about it? We could try, let's aim for something like twice a week. Or maybe we could start with once a week, because once is a lot more than zero. And then they say something like, well, we did all that dating when we were dating, and now we don't want to do that anymore. It's like, okay, so what are you saying here exactly? You don't want any more romance, and you don't want any more hot sex, and you don't want to put any work into it, and it's just going to happen magically, even though it's clearly not happening. That's your theory. And then let's run that theory out. Okay, so now you have new kids. It's going to be like that for a few years, maybe till they're 10 or 11. You're going to be occupied with your family. And so now you have a sexless marriage with no intimacy for a decade. So what does that look like in like 2032 when you're in divorce court?
Or you're recovering from some addiction of work or of alcohol or whatever it is, because your body's got to meet that need somewhere. And if it can't get a true deep connection, it will come up with all kind of cheap substitutes, right?
Yeah, like an affair. Of course you don't want to do this because it requires difficult negotiation, but how would you like to have your marriage deteriorate into hell over a 10-year period? How does that sound as an alternative? It's like, well, that's not very good. It's like, okay, so which of these two things are you more afraid of? When people really think that through, they think, oh yeah, well maybe, I could take the risk of making what I want known. And then, okay, so now you specify it. Well, a date, which night, how long? Are you going to find a babysitter? Are you going to do this every week? Who's going to be responsible for what in relationship to this date? All these details have to be negotiated. And then we remember, if this is 2 hours a week, then that's 15% of one day. That's another 5% of your life. And it's the intimate part of your life. And if you got that right, my God, you might be a much happier person. So that's another one of the only 25 things you have to take care of to set your life up. But I mean, you said, why are people afraid to do this? They're afraid to show their vulnerability, man. They don't trust their partner. They don't know how to negotiate. They don't even know what they want themselves. It's not that easy for someone to admit that they need any physical attention at all, even though everyone obviously does, because you're putting yourself on the line then. And that is the definition of intimacy in some sense.
I've rarely sat down across from somebody and had them be able to articulate, what do you actually want? They cannot answer that question, and they fill it with addictions, they fill it with hobbies, they fill it with dopamine chase. They fill it with so much stuff, and nobody can answer that question. What do you want? We just don't have a culture that has a shared vision of where we're headed. We have a culture of you're hurting and somebody else's fault, and let's start pointing fingers. And man, we've got to circle the wagons on a shared vision moving forward.
Yeah.
Because there's what do you want? No, that's not a question anybody asks.
The most difficult part of yourself to observe is the place where you're most blind, obviously. And so you can journal, you can concentrate on yourself, but that still might produce a situation where your blindest spots stay blind. And also, it limits your ability to problem solve creatively because you only draw on your own resources. One of the wonderful things about a marriage that's functional is that both of you have two brains to work out whatever problem happens to arise. And part of the reason that marriage is difficult is because life is difficult. You have to jointly confront the actual problems of life, which is what makes marriage different than an affair, which is a wish fulfillment fantasy in some sense of all the intimacy with none of the problems. A very terrible thing to do to your partner, who is then laden with only the problems. It's very useful to have two brains because each person is quite different, and the probability that the person you're communicating with will have a different take on both the problem and the solution is extremely high. Tinder is one of the forces that's transforming monogamy into polygamy. And the problem with polygamy is that it follows a Pareto distribution, like the distribution of wealth, is that some tiny minority of men get all the sexual opportunity and all the rest get virtually none. And that is a recipe for social instability.
The sort of deregulation of romantic relationships, whereas in the past it was expected for you to have one partner and over time settle down, whereas now it's a total free-for-all. There are aspects to this that a lot of people don't think about. I mean, I talk to young people, so I have younger friends who I talk to who are sort of very active on the apps and in sort of the dating scene, and they'll tell me things like it's even easier to cheat. So in the past, if you wanted to be unfaithful to your partner, it was risky because you had the same social circle, you had the same friends, everyone knew everyone else. But now with the apps, you can match with someone who is completely outside of your social reality, outside of your partner's social reality. You can have a very discreet rendezvous. No one will ever know about this.
These high dark triad guys are absolutely disastrous as long-term mates. They might be exciting for sure. I mean, that's why I think that women, as they mature, stop being attracted to these guys, especially if they're looking for a long-term mate, because these are guys, the dark triad, they're more likely to cheat. They're more likely to seduce and abandon. They're more likely to engage in deceptive mating tactics. They tend to be big trouble when it comes to long-term mating.